On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Amin Lakhani. He is the Director of Software Engineering at ServiceLink. We're going to be talking about a pretty crucial topic, actually, and it's about the pros and cons of elevating your best engineer to becoming a manager. A lot of times that is a course of action taken, and I think Amin's going to share with us some ideas of why that might not be the best idea and some alternative thoughts. I'm excited to have him on the podcast. Amin, thanks for being on.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks a lot for having me.
So I guess let's start at the top, understand better what ServiceLink does and kind of what your roles and responsibilities are, and then we'll dive right on in.
Sure. So ServiceLink is a subsidiary of Fidelity. We're in the mortgage space. Essentially, what we do is act as an orchestrator for all the various parties that are involved in any kind of mortgage transaction. So, if you've ever purchased a home or refinanced, there's the lender, there's the buyer, there's all these third parties like appraisers, notary publics, attorneys involved. And we basically act as an organizer for all those parties to make sure you can get through the mortgage process as easy as possible. So as the Director of Software Engineering, I oversee all of our default products. So that is, if someone stops payment on their mortgage, the products we offer lenders or mortgage holders to, renegotiate that mortgage, foreclose on the home all the way through, put that house up for auction through our ServiceLinkAuctions.com product.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about this topic around, obviously, a lot of companies, a lot of situations, people promote what is considered their strongest engineer into becoming a manager. I guess there's definitely pros and cons around that. I guess let's talk about just maybe your views of what best engineer means, or just to set some context, because I think it's really hard sometimes when we're obviously using those words, it's kind of a bit subjective, but when you're looking at maybe a strong engineer, what attributes are you seeing in that person that we'd consider that person strong?
Sure. So I think that question kind of boils down to how you look at impact that an engineer makes. And so our view, or my view, is that, there's three areas of impact every developer has. There is to the product or the project that they work on, right? So that is the quality of the code that they write, the fact that, they give good estimates, that they write, extendable, performant, mostly bug-free code. And that is usually where people stop with their evaluation of an engineer, right? But there's the other two things that are maybe just as important, which is, what is the impact you have on your team, right? Are you helping mentor junior developers? Are you helping eliminate blockers? Are you making sure we're following proper process? And then there's the impact you have on the overarching organization, right? Are you helping us onboard people? Are you pushing technical trainings, right? Stuff that's outside of your team that maybe you won't directly benefit from, but the overall process will, right? If you see something that we do that is a very manual process right now, and you can figure out how to automate it for us and then share that across every dev team, that impact is going to be much larger than just writing a really good feature or making sure your user stories get done on time. So when people say, hey, maybe it's not the best idea to promote your best engineer, what that tells me is that what they're looking at is just that first area of impact, right? What's the quality of code they write? And promoting that person into a role where they're not writing code all the time is a losing proposition. But if you look at all three areas of impact, then when you look at promoting someone, what you're doing is enabling them to focus on those two other areas to really get the most value out of them. And then that is, a winning proposition.
Absolutely. So I guess that makes sense. And I guess if you were going to look at, the flip side to this of what makes a good manager. So obviously, some of those attributes that you mentioned channel into what becomes eventually a good manager. Maybe highlight the qualities that when you're looking to put somebody into a manager role, what are the attributes that you weigh heaviest when you're trying to move somebody into, their first managing position?
Sure. So the things that I look at are, one, there has to be obviously technical excellence, right? So that doesn't mean you're the best, our best, engineer, or you write the best code, but you have to be able to communicate effectively to engineers, work with our architecture team. And so being able to have that technical excellence is important. But then on top of that, there is the communication with our business units, our product owners, our business analysts. There is the organizational aspect of it, right? As a manager, you've got 5, 10 people that you're overseeing, plus a bunch of dotted line responsibilities, and that having that organization or ability to organize and keep things moving smoothly is also very important. And then, like I mentioned before, the impact to our organization is also important, right? The number one thing that's going to determine whether or not you as a software engineering organization are successful is the culture that you instill, right? You can have the best processes in place, you can have the strongest engineers, but if your culture doesn't promote, using that process, if your culture doesn't keep people from leaving or having too much turnover, then you're going to be unsuccessful. So those are the three things, right? Technical excellence, the culture, and the organizational skills.
Absolutely. So I guess when you're kind of, when you're positioned, when you are trying to elevate somebody into a manager role, and you mentioned something about, technical excellence doesn't always mean the best coder. When you're trying to remove who is the eventual manager from a team, you obviously have to go backfill. And obviously, you might have dual or multiple tracks of, a leadership paths, not just people management. You might have some technical leadership tracks as well. How do you balance, obviously a manager might not be the best coder in the team, but obviously, good impact, a people manager understands some of those attributes that you were talking about, but you still need somebody who's anchoring the team that is potentially providing the best practices on the code side.
So what we do is we have that secondary track that is important, right? From going from a senior engineer to a principal engineer, which is at the same level as a manager. So that person has less people management responsibilities, but is just as important to a team success. So that person can help lead, do more pull requests, help push code implementation standards, and they still have the same kind of responsibilities in terms of areas of impact, but it will just look different, right? Maybe how they impact the greater organization is by helping us build internal tooling because they are that good technically. Or how they affect their team is by sitting down and pair programming with more junior level engineers. So it's at the same level, it's the same responsibilities, but it's just slightly different focus.
Interesting. And if you were, I guess, kind of similar, if you're looking at your senior engineers and obviously, you're trying to help mentor somebody down the technical track to becoming a principal engineer, what are some of those attributes? Obviously, being the best coder here might be one of those top attributes, but outside of that, what are the other attributes that you're looking into from hey, you're a senior engineer, you want to be a principal? What are some of those things people need to have?
I would say empathy is probably one of the most important ones. What you see a lot of, especially in engineering, is they're like, hey, I have a very narrow scope of what my job is. And so as a senior engineer, you think your job is to take a user story, break it into a dev task, write some commits, and then create some pull requests. And they don't see the human aspect of it, right? The mentoring part. Mm-hmm. Like I said, the senior devs who get promoted are the ones who understand that to really affect the team as best as I can, it's going to involve talking to other people. It's going to involve empowering the junior devs. It's going to involve pushing learning initiatives on your new technologies. And so those are the things I think we look for.
I actually like that a lot because I think sometimes it's when you are better than other people at something, sometimes it's a little bit hard to relate to somebody who's not as good. And you have to be able to kind of put yourself in that person's shoes. When you're looking at people who might excel down the technical leadership path and you're trying to get them opportunities to develop these skills they're going to need as a principal engineer, how should somebody go and maybe look for those type of opportunities that will build those skills? Because obviously it's one thing to wait for the manager to come say, hey, go do this. But if you're a senior engineer and you're like, hey, I want to be a principal engineer one day, what should you be proactively looking to do?
Sure. I mean, you should be looking for those opportunities where you can affect change, both on your team level, but on the greater organization. So, let's say you're really into, .NET 6 or a particular technology that is newer out there, and you've done a ton of research and evaluating it, going to your manager or your skip level manager and saying, hey, I've done a lot of research into this tech. It is where we're headed in the future. I would love to spend an hour running through it for our team and then other teams as well, right? and that is how you affect the larger organization. And then, within your team, like I said, get with your manager and talk about, hey, I know, let's not fully resource me this sprint so I can have some time to help others, right? Or knowing if a junior engineer is going to take on a user story that is maybe a little more complicated than they're used to, saying that, hey, feel free to reach out to me, or let's pair and handle that together. So it is just those trying to figure out how you can affect things that are outside of, typing on your keyboard.
Sure, that makes sense. I guess just out of curiosity, because obviously there's sometimes cases where people want hands-on managers, which to me is one of the trickiest roles, because it's kind of taking bits and pieces of, I need you to be still a strong engineer, but then I need you to also people manage, which kind of are, like we've been talking about, potentially two different types of skills you're developing. What are your thoughts when people try to put somebody in a, like a player coach type of situation there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just you're just asking for someone to create a bottleneck, right? So what I'll say, when people try to have that player coach role, especially when they try to do it 50-50, it is very rarely successful, because those are just two such disparate skill sets. So a manager still has to be technical. In our organization, we ask them to do pull requests and make sure that they're giving meaningful feedback. And I don't think anyone who at a certain point was primarily writing code ever wants to stop doing that. Like, I am the director of engineering and I still write code. None of it ever goes into production, but it's for internal tools or a script I want to write. So we want to make sure that we keep those skills strong, but never in an absolutely necessary critical pathway.
I think player coach situations are always tricky unless you've just got this dynamic that needs to be addressed that way. But you just mentioned something interesting, that you still write code. And I was going to ask you, so for you as a manager of managers, how do you keep those skills sharp? Like, diving in and writing some code. Obviously, most of your days spent away from the keyboard writing code. How do you maintain that level of sharpness so that when you have to jump back in, you're ready to go?
Yeah, so one thing I do is, so none of the code I write is actually for any of our products. So if there's any customers listening right now, it's fine.
They're safe. You're not typing anything in there that's going to affect their lives. Okay, that's good to know.
Like, I will write some reporting services, right? If we want to get more standardized reporting across all our teams, I will go and create a service and write some C# code to pull that data out of DevOps or Jira or wherever. Or write a static analyzer tool because we're doing something manually and wasting a dev's day on something where if we have some time, someone can write something in a week or two to take over that task. So that is kind of, I look for those little opportunities here and there for something that is absolutely not critical, something that will absolutely never go into production, but it keeps me strong. And then also, part of our recruiting process is the tech screen. So I'll take a couple of those to ensure that, I'm kind of staying as technical as I can and not just, someone who sits in meetings all day.
Actually, that was awesome, by the way. But I mean, I think that's great insight. I think you're probably being modest. I'm sure you could probably jump back in and start cranking out if you had to. But let me ask you this, because I think, we're talking about, originally we mentioned don't put your best engineer based on certain attributes into management roles. It might not be the best fit. So obviously you're going to elevate somebody into management role that is the right person to be a manager. The technical person could go down a technical leadership track. That dynamic of, obviously you got a principal engineer who's at the same level as a manager. Talk about that relationship a little bit, right? So the manager knows they're people managing. There's a little bit of, you're going to let the principal engineer handle the technical side. But as a manager, knowing that that's no longer your strength, how do you balance that relationship? And how do you, go, hey, you know what? I still have ideas, but when do I interject those? Let the principal or the, architects handle what they need to do?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, how I foster that relationship is make sure I'm just enabling as much collaboration between those two people as possible. The last thing I want them to do is silo themselves off and tell you, this is what my responsibility is and this is what your responsibility is. So I want to make sure that those people are working together as a team, that there is a ton of overlap, because that also helps if we lose one of them, if one of them goes on vacation for 2 weeks, then it's not all of a sudden we have this technical debt, we have this area of ignorance that, we have to try to replace. It is, someone can pick up the slack in the meantime.
I like that. And I guess when you're looking at, the relationship, and obviously when there is, maybe there's a disagreement, not disagreement, but let's say you do see a potential path that you're not as comfortable with, and you're sitting down with the principal engineers to have that discussion. And obviously this may be going back now as a director, but maybe people on your team or just maybe your previous, experience. How do you navigate that conversation of saying, hey, you know what, I know I'm not the hands-on person anymore, but have you guys thought about this, without obviously, trying to interject too far, too much?
One of the issues, especially for me, is I still remember when I was a developer. So I still feel like I've got those chops. But I just try to remind myself that, one, they're closer to the code than I am, especially in the day-to-day of it. So I think I always look at my role is to ask the obvious question to make sure that they've looked at that. And then hopefully that sparks enough conversation that we can figure out, a solution to what the issue is.
Absolutely. If you were to kind of, I guess, go back and kind of think about, the principal conversation point of, elevating your, making your best engineer a manager, is there a positive use case of putting that person ever in that situation? Or is it typically, the people management side will override any benefits that their technical, again, you probably just put them on the principal engineering track anyways, but if somebody does want that manager title, like, I guess the better question is, how do you balance that? Because they might want that, they want that leadership position, but
then we ask them, to show us those skills, right?
Yep.
To show us the other areas of impact and the people management skills and the leadership skills. If they demonstrate that, then there's no issue. The issues only really arise, and I think we've all worked in organizations like this, where people take just whoever's the best technically and promote them, and that person approaches the manager job as more of an individual contributor job, right? They look at their role as building great software rather than helping build an organization that can build great software. And then, you start seeing the attrition on their team, the kind of impact over the organization starts to lessen. So that is the kind of pitfall of if you just look at technically who's the best.
Even out of technology, I think if you've worked for someone who doesn't have those people management skills, I think a lot of times people do approach it as a senior IC trying to delegate. And I don't think that necessarily is what helps a team, but that's when you don't have, sense of what a manager does. I was going to ask, when you were to go back before getting into being a manager versus now, how well prepared were you for the actual job? I know this was a couple of years going back, but just out of curiosity, did you know what you're getting yourself into as a manager? Was it one of those where you had an idea, but man, the reality was just, far different? Or was it, I got exactly what I was hoping for?
No, I was lucky enough that I got kind of eased into it over my career. Like I had a very traditional, started off or I interned at a bunch of places, and then I worked as, like a second level engineer, and then a senior engineer, and then like a lead engineer that oversaw the team, but wasn't a people manager or like a direct HR manager, and then kind of took that next step and then into director. So for me, I feel like it was kind of just a natural progression.
Awesome.
I had a manager at Microsoft who would regularly talk about, having operational hygiene, or he would call it operational rigor. And I would remember thinking to myself, like, I'm too busy working to do like the little red tape stuff. And then I will find myself now at ServiceLink saying the same exact things and going back and going, oh, okay, now I get why he was so keen on making sure we were all doing those things. And I have those stories for, all the way back to when I was just a normal engineer. I was like, I don't want to update my Jira tickets. And as a manager, I was like, okay, now I get it, why that's so important.
Interesting. Yeah, operational rigor. That's a good quote. I had heard it that way, but I like the way that's put because it makes you feel a lot more involved in some of that process versus when somebody say, hey, you just have to follow, the operating procedures of the company, or making sure, you're following what the guidelines are. But I like that word rigor, by the way. That's really clever. I guess when you're kind of looking at your experience and having a manager that seemed like they're pretty good, how much of, outside of this one, obviously component you just mentioned, how much of what you were learning under that person have you carried? How much of it did you evolve and make your own? Like, what was the kind of carry forward from that?
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to have some really great managers, and I constantly find myself thinking to myself, like, hey, what would they do in this situation? And, the ones that were really great were the ones who, gave us autonomy and then, helped set a culture of like trust and safety, that you knew that you weren't going to be micromanaged and you weren't going to have people looking over your shoulder, and that you were empowered to make the decisions you needed to make. And so that is always something that I'm trying to bring to, my day-to-day responsibilities.
Awesome. When you're, I guess, sitting down and doing your one-on-ones, your, performance reviews, how much of the, I guess, discussion that you're sitting down and having with somebody is based on you trying to figure out, do they become a better people manager potentially, or are they better served focusing a little bit more on the technical leadership side?
Yeah, I think because my direct reports right now are all either already picked that path, or either principal engineers or managers, very little of it. But previously, a lot of it was, helping them find opportunities within the company to grow, right? Because back when I was a manager, the growth there was, you have to leave the team to go somewhere else, right? So we want to make sure that they stay within the company so we don't lose them.
Absolutely. That's maybe I guess, years ago, that was the door that was eventually the only option you had was, my manager's not going anywhere for the next 10 years. I've got to leave to become a manager. But now I think the growing trend is, can we find the right path for you so that you feel fulfilled and that you want to stay? And we'll give you an opportunity to grow your skills in a way that kind of fits what your goals are as well.
Yeah, exactly. That is, I think, part of the culture you try to instill is that, hey, everyone is a leader and you can take on as much responsibility as you want, right? So, and then again, like I said, finding opportunities within the company. Maybe it's not necessarily on that team that you're on, but there are other teams, there are other openings. So always kind of keep an eye out and make sure that people are growing and happy where they are.
Absolutely. All right, man. I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on and sharing. I think it's an interesting topic because it happens still. People do promote the best engineers to manager. I think you brought up some great observations, and I love the having operational rigor story. So I appreciate you sharing with us. If someone wants to ping you and kind of talk to you about anything on the podcast that you mentioned, is LinkedIn a good spot to reach you? Twitter is our preferred avenue?
Yeah, LinkedIn is probably the best way to reach me.
Okay. So we'll make sure to include your LinkedIn in the show notes just so that if anyone does want to reach out to you, they can. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, I always ask for two things. One, if you did like the episode, share it with somebody that might benefit. That's how we've been growing, and I appreciate that. Secondly, if you do want me to talk about a specific topic, feel free to reach out to me, let me know, and I'll do my best to find a guest. Until next time, goodbye.